Das sind die Grußworte von Gabriele Adinolfi und ich denke, nichts wäre passender, als einen weiteren Landsmann dieses Denkers der Neuen Rechten nun anschließend zu Wort kommen zu lassen. Und in dem Sinne möchte ich bitten, Marco Malaguti seinen Vortrag vorzutragen und uns mehr über die notwendige spirituelle Revolution zur Erlangung der europäischen Souveränität zu sagen.
Thank you to everyone for coming, and I'm sorry my Deutsch is very bad, so I will talk in English and I hope everyone will understand. I will try to talk slowly, and after my intervention feel free to ask if you lost something and if you have questions. So, dear comrades and friends, my name is Marco Malaguti and I represent in this forum Progetto Prometeo, an editorial project of cultural and political counter-offensive founded in Rome on the last 6th of October with the aim of acting like a scalpel within the new sheen of the identitarian, populist and sovereignist counterculture of my country and Europe. The new European populist course, which makes our people ask for more security, more sovereignty, more identity through the political parties we know so well, is a unique opportunity for patriots to surgically operate a political culture that suffers from a still very strong contamination with the cancerous metastasis of the liberal culture and of the Weltanschauung actually dominant. The new political course of Europe, where we find patriotic and conservative parties in the governments of some nations, I think, for example, about my country, but also about Hungary, Austria, Estonia, requires a massive commitment by all the most acute minds of the sovereignist area to arrive at the construction of a true political culture for a galaxy that appears, rather than as political corpus defined by a clear ideological framework, a gathering of idiosyncrasies towards certain factors and political elements perceived as subliminal threats, but not yet translated into a clear enemy form. Today, still we haven't any clear map of the political targets to be achieved. The confusion under the sky is great, but the situation, contrary to the Mao Zedong's maxim, is not excellent. We have people who recognize the enemy to be annihilated in the euro, who instead in the European Union, in NATO, in banks, or in immigrants, or in Islam, or in the various leftist groups. How can an army to achieve victory if it doesn't know to which herd the tips of his spears converge to? How can it be possible to speak about sovereignty when we are not even sovereigns of our own plans, left at the mercy of sentimentality, unstable but not justifiable, able to direct our hatred on non-decisive targets? As an Italian, I can say that one of the greater errors in the history of nationalist and national revolutionary cycles in my country was to make the teachings of Baron Julius Evola completely distorted, exchanging the ineluctable need to ride the tiger with a terrible electoral opportunistic Machiavellism and the need to improve us in the struggle with ourselves with a voluntary self-closure in ivory towers that prevented us from dialoguing with a society in a profound change. By this, I do not mean to say that a process of self-change is to be excluded or not necessary to the current European society, but such processes of self-mutation must necessarily be separated from liberal individualism, which finds in certain nihilistic poses by last man a comfortable excuse. In fact, there are no changes that can be achieved alone if we intend as patriots to place ourselves in a community, patriotic and sovereignist perspective. There are only epochal, revolutionary and mass changes. While we reject liberalism, in fact, we also reject the vision of the world that proclaims man as a Stirnerian monad totally independent of the other monads and bound by nothing other than corporal needings and their own brutal well-being. It is therefore self-evident that before we can approach a physical revolution or any identitarian regime change in Europe, it is our duty to start a spiritual revolution. But this revolution is not to be carried out exclusively in one's own internal processes, as often stated by eminent traditionalists of the past, but must instead be a synthesis of a political revolution and an individual revolution. It is therefore a civil spirit, the soul of Europe, that must rebel, and not just a single soul or a group of souls. The true spiritual revolution consists in the union of the souls of individuals who rebel alongside the collective soul, the Volksgeist, and all together they descend into the arena. But let's get out of the plans of the abstract and metaphors. What is this project and this process? Does spirit equate to religion? If I talk about a spiritual revolution, do I automatically talk about religion? All the traditional doctrines agree in affirming that man, even before joining some religious currents or some traditions, possesses at least a potential level, a natural law which does not necessarily bring to the good. It directs through soul and physical disposition to it. The mother's sense of protection for her child, the woman's love for the self-giving to man, the husband's sense of protection for his wife, the hatred for the injustice that the robbed person feels in fact of the theft, are human dispositions that stand out before the appearance of the sacred in the world. While rejecting the Enlightenment and the positivist assumption that sees man as good in itself, the patriot recognizes the tendency towards goodness as part of man. We recognize as a natural law orientates, albeit without leading on a leash man to good. Men who can, then, take the most different path in absolute freedom, but whose sight remains shaped by the prism of good. Evil, in a nutshell, is always a choice. What should be the first point of a European spiritual revolution? The first point doesn't talk about churches, nor about altars, nor about rituals, but about introspection. I would dare to say of popular introspection. Attacking today the European Union, Islam, banks, or anything else means acting in hatred to the symptom rather than to the cause. Europe, which is primarily a metaphysical entity, even before being a continent with clear and well-defined borders, suffers from a worse evil, an evil that does not exclusively attack all sectors of civil life, but which attacks upstream of them. The name of this disease is liberalism. Liberalism is a disease of the immune system that affects societies and states. Like all immunological disease, it affects the defense system of its victims, making them unable to defend themselves, attacking the defense cells, in our case, family, religion, society, and sense of the state, leaving the victims without any possibility of defending itself. In itself, liberalism doesn't kill societies, which is why it is very difficult to diagnose the disease, but it sets up the organism it attacks to find itself without defenses compared to other diseases, even if they are not serious, which before the liberal attack would have been easily cured. Here, then, after the liberal virus attack, like a stock market storm, an increase in the price of an electric component, or an invasion of an armed people, are sufficient to destroy a society that had survived crusades, pestilence, and world wars. So that's why not only is it difficult, but impossible to save a society without fighting liberalism, which is what prevents it from defending itself. There is no use in fighting against immigration or Islam and defining ourselves liberals, since the virus predisposed to the attack of many other diseases, like demographic sclerosis, drugs, sexual confusion, anarchy, communism, individualism, economic exploitation, free love, etc. While the migration problem or the Islamization disappear, another disease that will kill the patient with no possibility of appeal could immediately arise. The main enemy of man of this era, who intend to reject the current order of things, is precisely liberalism, and this, in the sector most of the forefront of counterculture, is already established. But how deeply liberalism has entered into our way of conceiving politics is a theme that is still very little investigated. Often, without even knowing it, we try to fight liberalism with its own weapons, or worse still, with its own conceptual maps. Indeed, the problem of all the antagonistic movements of today is their being such antagonistic. Their claim is, in a more or less declared way, the disruption of today's liberal order of politics and the capitalist and post-industrial order of the economy. Assuming that the two orders are separable, we can substantially define these two objects as the targets of modern protest movements both on the part of the extreme right and of the extreme left. In spite of this, in the movements and party of the both sides, there are so many debates, discussions, exchanges and publications on why such positions fail to take root in a large part, even if only electorally or culturally, of the population to which they are addressed. We can say that today dreamers do not have easy life, unless it is obviously those who continue to dream about the famous magnificent progressive fates and the end of the history theorized by Fukuyama. We can call dreamers all those that are commonly called idealists, not the overwhelming majority, but even the totality of political forces, regardless of whether or not they appear in the election, which refer to a great return of the ideal and aesthetics are numerically, culturally, and therefore also politically insignificant. The political consciousness of today's revolutionary activists, therefore, enters into a short circuit from which is very difficult to get out. If today's revolutionary is in fact an idealist, it is likely that he would even agree to die rather than renounce his utopian and aesthetic demands. And the point of his inner debate is precisely that. The obsessively present question in every type of movement today, as any person who has lived in or the margins of these militant realities can confirm, is always the same: where do we go wrong? The question, where do we go wrong, seen from a democratic lens, which actually permeates even those who say they are fiercely against it, has only one answer: we are not wrong anywhere. If the political target of the idealist, or the patriot, or the identitarian, for example, it's just to the affirmation of his own aesthetically political will, is the continual remarking of faith in his ideals, then he substantially doesn't make any mistake, as he behaves like an adept to a religion. He absolves his political sacraments by participating to meetings, debates, conferences, demonstrations for the affirmation of his own imaginary at the expense of the others, exactly as a militant priest or a monk would do who, withdrawn in his hermitage in the mountains, praying constantly for the salvation of the world in the most correct way. The idealistic revolutionary is therefore enabled to give himself a concrete answer to the reasons for his political failure. And this is not because his intellectual means or his social skills are insufficient or mediocre, since even great minds have puzzled over this problem, but rather for the fact that today's revolutionary has not faded. He has, paradoxically, perfectly perfected his task and fulfilled his mission, namely the constant vindication of his own identity peculiarities from the political point of view, and not rather the real affirmation of what which, according to him, would be the most correct way to manage politics as a whole. However, a dichotomy arises. Where the rebel and the revolutionary impulses are nothing but mere subculture of youth, a clear dissatisfaction because of this continuous bumping into the tragic reality of never getting what one really wants can come up. On the contrary, instead, there are also many revolutionaries, the so-called idealists, who claim to feel perfectly at ease in the role they have given themselves. Now we ask ourselves, what is more liberal than the mere complacency of remarking what individually we are, without any desire for change in the community and social context in which we live? Here we can basically identify the dividing line between the sincere revolutionary and those who are not. Namely not with the usual canons that these movements impose, for example, those who have the courage to face to prison or not, who has the courage to face possible aggressions or not, but rather those who always accept defeat willingly without even making a concrete examination of their mistakes, indeed finding in the debacle a sacrament of their identity belonging, drowning everything in a perverse nihilistic joy aimed at an aestheticizing myth of defeat as proof of veracity of their thesis. Who does not accept this way of seeing things is actually a true revolutionary, regardless of the movement or party in which he has decided to join. Many members of nationalist and patriotic movements claim to be perfectly satisfied or even entertained by doing what they do. Some time ago, I had the opportunity to read online the statement of a far-right activist who commented nonchalantly about the catastrophic electoral results of his movements. At least we really had fun. This statement is perhaps the clearest answer to all those authentic revolutionaries who continue to lose sleep over texts of political theory in search of their mistakes. So the point today is not to know who we are, because who we are as patriots we know very well, but rather what we really want. According to the liberal democratic man, politics is indeed a general overview of society as a whole, but also and above all, like religion, a private fact which can be identified patriotically, even vehemently, but which is always and in any case brought back to the swamp of inclusiveness. A swamp represented by the fact that any decision must always be compromised with other people who do not think like him, but also still democratic. In a nutshell, the Democrat narcissistically traits his real decision-making power, sovereignty, visible only with the disappointment of someone else, with the unquestionable right to show his Weltanschauung, with the pre-packaged political act, and with empty aesthetic remark of what one is. We can therefore affirm that all those for whom being a revolutionary is nothing more than a continuous affirmation of identity and the continuous taking away from a mass of people seen as incapable of understanding the beauty of their dreams is actually a perfect democratic liberal person. It may seem obvious, but the first requirement of a person dissatisfied of the status quo, it is not to understand how to change, but rather to ask himself as an individual and as a people or nation if he is really available to strip himself of the liberal democratic Weltanschauung, bypassing idolatry for the typical ideal of nostalgism, but also theoretically of democracy. It is indeed very unlikely that the current model of representative democracy will be able to maintain itself with the sole strength of its own ideas and its mobilizing potential. To survive, free democracy has an absolute needing of nostalgia and myths. It is itself a nostalgism, like the fascism that it accuses of living in the past, towards a utopian and never existed democratic ideal. Politics, as the early Romantics understood, is essentially a struggle between different dreams, and the liberal democratic dream one is certainly not the strongest. Where, in history, representative and liberal democracies has come to be truly such, it has always systematically surrendered in a short time to the assault of totalitarian phalanxes. The current European liberal system of government is unable to mobilize anyone, using only the force of its ideals. Where democracy was called to confront with the totalitarian forces by playing according to its true rules, through universal suffrage, through freedom of association, real freedom of speech, it ended up being overwhelmed by the mobilizing potential of dreams and utopias. It is no coincidence that in the Arab countries, where democracy has been benevolently imported from the West, the elections, which initially took place in a climate of chaotic freedom, present dozens of candidates in the hand, they always are won by the group